Okay, so welcome again to the second part of our conversation with Dr. Anthropology. You are that uses this honorifics and honorifics to talk.
If I was a surgeon, they would call me Mr.
We are moving today from octopi to the commons. So, commons, enclosures, and second talk of our visiting scholar during the Anthropology and Social Intensive. Welcome to more time. We will keep welcoming you to another night. And after this, we are going to, like last time, today, moving to all the groups. Okay? In any case, welcome. And everybody.
So where do I come from? Where am I coming from with this? For a long time, most of my life as a researcher and scholar has been spent studying processes of what we would call enclosure. So looking at conservation, politics around mines, particularly in Madagascar, and looking at what sorts of transformations happen on the ground when lands and other resources are enclosed, often without informed consent of the people who are going to be most affected by those, people who are farmers, foragers, fishers, sort of thing. And so after studying the politics of conservation in Madagascar, which is like a highly authoritarian approach to conservation, very strongly underwritten by a locally adapted or naturally trying to give a common story, of course. These processes of dispossession as they were happening. Questions at conferences, mostly, wow, that's depressing. When people would ask me what I studied, and I was like, well, no, it's actually not only depressing. It's people are also fighting. People are fighting these things. They don't often win big, and struggle is something that really doesn't end. But it's not only depressing. You learn a lot about people's resilience and values and passions and connections to place when you're studying these sorts of problems. But then at the same time, I started thinking about, well, what are other lenses that I can use to look at these things that I'm studying? Looking at ilmenite mining that's transforming space and dispossessing some people because a port's being built and dispossessing others for biodiversity offsets. And, are there other lenses that I can use to look at how you have solidarities being built across different countries through activist connections? And then I started talking to people and I started thinking, and I discovered pretty big body of literature that I wasn't very familiar with before, but that's the literature on commoning, which is a variation of the literature on commons, but coming from a very particular sort of feminist, autonomous, Marxist, historical, very political perspective, which focuses on commons not as a resource to be governed or to be consumed, but commons as active social processes through which people come together and through various situated dynamics, figure out how we're going to create value for each other. So it was kind of like a profound shift when I started getting into that literature, and it offered just a whole new world of insight about the things that I'd already been studying. But also is something that I can use alongside understanding politics around enclosure, which are enacted everywhere from the micro-local, where what we call the mine site, or the protected area, or the implementation zone, depending on what sort of activity we're talking about, all the way up to international national politics and global institutions. Because after all, when we hear about the state of the world being broken and the triple crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These messages are coming from somewhere too, and they're filtering into policy frameworks in ways that then have, again, in turn, profound impacts on those localities. So this is some of my motivation behind, taking this kind of route. And this is the motivation behind the development of the Center for Future Natures that was established in 2021, bringing together storytelling, arts, and research, looking at what we call politics of crisis and enclosure, and also the possibilities of the existing commons as an actually existing alternative. Because we hear about alternatives a lot, especially like in the kind of like techno-fixie literature. There's always like, what are the alternatives, to sea level rise, or the consequences of climate change? What are these like social alternatives that we can implement to put a fix in place? But this is a different type of alternative. These are alternatives from the ground up. People, coming from particular situated positions in places that they know intimately, confronting very very big odds, some of which are related to climate change and species loss and things like that, but also sometimes related to the things that are ultimately driving those processes, like extractivism, like mega infrastructure development projects and these sorts of things. And also, like, another motivation for this is, as somebody who's an anthropologist and political ecologist, thinking about commons, thinking about enclosure, thinking about value, these are all really important reference points for our research. And I say reference points, I don't say like themes or topic areas, I say reference points because they're all like sort of contested areas. They're all areas where there's a ton of literature out there, but there's no real consensus on what we mean when we use this word. So commons, enclosure, and value, these are all reference points for anthropology. And anthropologists have done a lot of research on them, but they're also reference points for people engaged in struggle, who are also, writing about and telling about their experiences and theorizing them as well. And so you have these huge areas of thought, of research, and of engaged practice. Although in most of academia, dominant notions of the commons, they tend to politically align with kind of two camps, or two related camps. One would be Garrett Hardin's persistent neo-Malthusian story of the tragedy of the commons. So who's familiar with Garrett Hardin's piece? Okay, so about a quarter of the room. So I'll talk a little bit about that then. And the other, with the pragmatism of the new institutionalist economics that are associated with Nobel Prize winning political scientist Elinor Ostrom, who is a lovely lady, even though I am going to critique her approach today. Yeah, so most times that we hear about the commons spoken about in policy literature and across the social sciences, it's coming from one of these kind of traditions, either to articulate a kind of crisis situation, saying the commons are under threat, or taking a kind of pragmatic look at problems around whether you used to call it the collective action problem, it's still called the collective action problem. Basically, how do people figure out what to do about a thing when they have to talk to each other, or live in the same place, or work together? But yeah, so these are the two kind of dominant camps. Although there are lots of other ways of thinking about commons. The kind of Ostrom focus on small populations in rural areas governing particular natural resources. This is what we might call classic commons. There's so much literature on this. Elinor Ostrom has so many students doing such a variety of in-depth empirical research on resource governance. One of the shortcomings of this approach, now which there are always exceptions, and there are so many people who are trained in this tradition that it's really not fair to generalize. But, kind of one, limitation, I think, of the approach is that the kind of, classic commons approach really kind of doesn't depart strongly enough, in my opinion, from rational choice theory. It focuses more on internal dynamics rather than political economic context. And has strange notions about the sustainability of commons, which don't gel for me with more of the thinking around commoning as a social process, which would of course be, the sustainability of which would be contingent on the problem being addressed, I would think, if a problem was being addressed. Then of course, there's new commons, literature on the new commons, which tends to be stuff that's enabled through new technologies, or can refer to things that are newly being called commons, like climate and oceans and things like that, which I don't personally think are commons, but that's a debate to be had with people, and it's very distinct. But yeah, these are all called the new commons, even though I don't really see what connects maker spaces and climate change, to put them in a category together, other than they're more recently recognized. Yeah, and then of course, like I mentioned, commoning is another approach. I think as anthropologists, we can say with certainty and elaborate in very rich detail how for the great majority of our history and evolution of the species, day-to-day social life and production have for most people carried on in self-organized ways, either prior to, outside of, or in defiance of the direct control of state and market actors and institutions. And this is basically what I would call commons, coming from that commoning perspective. If we had to describe it as a thing, even though I don't think commons are a thing, I think they're very perceptual and political. So, in many ways, commons are disciplinary bread and butter, just looking at, ethnographic traditions and the sorts of places and peoples and social forms of social organization that anthropologists have long studied in making the strange familiar. Is there a reference again? Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of like our bread and butter. We have this huge empirical, huge empirical legacy of research on commons, and it really produces a vast body of knowledge on the ways in which plurality of forms of value are socially produced, and in turn fuel the reproduction of social life in order to sustain people, and also to sustain people's struggles for free life across time and space in many different ways. And likewise, I think an important critical intellectual legacy, beyond the empirical, of anthropology and adjacent scholarship could arguably be characterized as a long and multifaceted argument, unpacking, challenging assumptions about human demographic change, self-interest, scarcity, and Leviathan solutionism that are embodied in the tragedy of the common story. In no small part as a reaction to its long usefulness in justifying processes of enclosure from above. So just to catch folks up on tragedy of the commons, I actually really like talking about tragedy of the commons because I feel like I spent my whole career arguing against it, particularly to conservation professionals in Madagascar. But in 1968 or 69, I can't remember which, an ecologist named Garrett published a short essay in the journal Science, which we know as whoa, huge credential there. But I say essay on purpose. This essay outlined a problem that he described as the tragedy of the commons. The essay draws on game theory and borrows the metaphor of the local commons, in this case, a pasture open to all, to argue that humans will inevitably overuse and deplete any, what he described as a common pool resource, because the inability to restrict people's use of it creates incentives for self-interested, rational beings to consume as much as possible of the shared resource before others can do the same. Everything's fine and good while the population of herders is small. However, as the human population grows. The race to pasture more and more animals traps actors in a vicious cycle of mismanagement and overconsumption. This ultimately leads to irreversible degradation and the exhaustion, of the shared resource of pasture. In Hardin's thesis, the only choice, and this is really important, the only choice to subvert the tragedy is for a higher level authority to enclose the commons through either privatization or some sort of state territorialization and management. Of course, so like this is basically the Thanos argument, right? I'm serious. Thanos is a neo-Malthusian. We're familiar with the Avengers. He snapped to, cut the population of the universe in half and make everything beautiful again, right? Hardin's tragedy wasn't really a news story when it was published in 1968 or 69. It actually repackaged and updated a lot of older stories about efficiency, which had been the primary justification of the English enclosures, even though they weren't all used to pasture sheep. They were used to have hunting grounds and all sorts of recreational facilities for rich people. Stories about self-interest, the tragedy's representation of the commons as dangerous, anarchic, feeding spaces where people are just breeding. This was lifted from Thomas Hobbes' notion of the commons, where the proverbial war of all against all, man understood nature, where the proverbial war of all against all rages and life is, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A story that was inspired by and in turn provided rhetorical fuel for colonization and imperial expansion. Tragedy also wasn't really about the commons, or at least not about the metaphorical local pasture, which only takes up a few inches in the essay alongside the hazards of free parking meters, nuclear warfare, human rights conventions, and the freedom to breed. In classic neo-Malthusian stories, like this one, the pasture, of course, represents the earth, and Hardin was attempting an update, a moral intervention, regarding the spurious association between human overpopulation and ecological collapse. This was an obsession of his in line with his well-documented white nationalist, anti-immigrant, eugenicist, and quasi-fascist values. But it was also, at the time, highly resonant with the concerns and discourses of the new northern liberal environmentalist movement, high-level concerns of the extractive industry, and also concerns of multilateral institutions around the global carrying capacity issue related to, of course, resource scarcity and the so-called limits to growth. Hardin's tragedy, the story, is really important because of what it says about the nature of the world and people in it, of course. Like I said last night, the stories we tell can be really powerful, especially when they're backed with authority. It's been really politically important. It's been institutionalized, really, as a means of justifying processes of neoliberal enclosure, particularly in the policy discourses for any number of sorts of enclosure, actually, since the 70s. And how does it do this, despite being discredited, despite containing no empirical evidence, despite misusing very basic economic concepts like common pool resource when they really meant was open access resource, and just being pretty incoherent all in all, and also very racist. It's actually become received wisdom, rule of thumb. It's really common sense in many fields now. The essay's been identified as the one publication having the greatest career impact on biologists and environmental scientists, and the most frequently cited research article in those fields. Undergraduates who are imagining careers varying from Earth system science to environmental management to big C conservation, like running WWF or something, sustainable international development, any number of fields, will have been assigned it numerous times as required reading as undergrads. So this is the story of the tragedy of the commons. It's hugely powerful, written in 1969, but also repackaging older stories that were justifying enclosure long before Garrett Hardin was born. And this is, like I was saying, something that I think has become a critical intellectual legacy of anthropologists is, confronting the way that this story has manifested in places that they've worked and lived in different ways, because it's so easily adaptable to context. And I think this critical legacy remains really important. We need to be aware of where these narratives come from, especially as, crisis itself has become a space of value production and accumulation. And that's only going to increase in the future. But I don't think this critical legacy is enough. I think we need to go farther, because the geography, the politics, the technological, the environmental dimensions of resource struggles and social action are evolving in ways that really stretch and challenge well-established concepts and frameworks, especially those that can be blind to situated people's experiences of struggle, to practices of governance and social life, and also to the politics that affects people's lives. So in this talk, what I really want to do, and what I want to hear back from folks in here about during the question period, is I want to explore how our understanding of the global terrain of social action can be extended and deepened by really rethinking the commons relationally, not just as an institutional form, not just as a material resource or property relation, but as really kind of a multidimensional idea, really, about social action, but also like a real form of social action that's constituted through and emergent from value struggle. I think that like one of the big takeaways here, or maybe the big takeaway here, and its relevance to anthropology too, is that struggles to sustain and defend free life in commons, they're always going to involve contestations around value and values. And they'll always require navigating the politics and the actuality of enclosure. And when I say the actuality of enclosure, I mean the actual dynamics of like fencing or dispossessing people, copywriting ideas and things like that, but also the stories that support it and the politics that support it and justify it. For the past few hundred years at least, the nature of these struggles has been shaped by capital's hegemonic notions of value on one side as a quantitative relationship between things embodied in the commodity form, and on the other side, a pluriverse of values that bind together the social relationships and the socio-natural ones too, which generate all the forms of wealth that ever exist in society. So yeah, I'm basically using this talk to get some ideas out of my head, like I said. So yeah, if you have a pencil and you want to take notes, feel free to do so. So just, the title's Commons, Enclosure, and Value Struggle, but I'm not going to go in that order. I'm actually going to jump around a bit. But I think, it makes sense to start by talking about value, and particularly value in relation to capitalism's basically mythology which mythology, right? But the mythology specifically of like a totalizing, self-reproducing economic system. I think value is at the center of this mythology, and this, I'm not the only one who thinks that, this system can be only made to appear real by invisibilizing or subordinating a rich and diverse array of values, value practices, social relationships, to what appears as if by magic as a single and universalized metric, exchange value. This manifests as what's been called an amoral ratio, and an inherent characteristic of commodities, like pounds per unit of widget, euros per doohickey, dollars per thingamajig, how it goes. This invisibilization is well captured by what Marx called the illusions of the Trinity formula of rent, wages, and profit, the value of which become attributed to things, i.e. Land or nature, labor, and capital or institutions, respectively, rather than the diverse human doings and socio-natural relationships that are generative, again, of all forms that value takes. This works through, of course, the fetish of commodities and the role of exchange value as masking social relations from the consumer standpoint, but also deeper alienating processes that take away people's autonomy and control over how daily life and production are organized, to what ends and to whose benefits, creating a sense of separation from the product of one's own labor, from the processes of labor itself, from other workers, and from one's own human potential, as one might imagine. This allows these things, which all life production and socio-natural production depend on, to be enclosed, treated as private property, or even as commodities themselves, and socially controlled, of course, generally by the property owners. Thus, I think we can fairly think of enclosure as not only a social relation, but also a mechanism of value transformation, and in turn, a fundamental base of struggle in capitalism. So when we talk about the old enclosures, I don't know about y'all, but I had a section on that in high school. It was like the enclosure movement. Fences were built. The end. When we mention enclosure, most people think to the old enclosures in the global north and the origin story of capitalism. And this was associated in particular with what Marx called primitive accumulation, and the widespread dispossession of the English peasantry from common land, forests, and other productive resources from about the 13th century. This involved violent disruption of peasant self-sufficiency by separating people from their productive base. And this was done through fencing, policing, doing away with legal entitlements, and ultimately doing away with existing commons through a combination of multiple means: legal, military, financial, and biopolitical. Everyday life, independent food production systems, patterns of work, situated relationships between people and their environments, forms of knowledge, medical practices, all sorts of things were disrupted and reconfigured. And as this was happening, what we don't generally learn about in that section in high school is that this is when the modern conceptualization of nature was invented. Lands, forests, and waters were being reimagined in utilitarian terms and economic terms as stocks of economic resources, and control of these material inputs, and also, of course, the technologies of production were becoming concentrated in the hands of the few as private property. Mass privatization transformed the governance of nature, now resources, labor, and also social institutions, including the family. And dispossessed commoners were left, of course, lacking control over even their own subsistence and possessing little of value in this changing system, aside from the capacities of their own bodies to do work. So the story of the old enclosures often just ends there, with capitalism springing from the dismantled English feudal order as if by inevitability, magic. But the process of dispossession and enclosure was actually repeated across Europe from about the mid-1700s until well after World War I, through different means in different places, of course. It was very contingent on legal frameworks, etc. But also, like, the institutional changes and forms of wealth accumulation that were happening in Europe at this time that were associated with industrialization wouldn't have been possible without the advent of the legal differentiation of labor on the basis of race, and the violent extension of processes of enclosure and dispossession to diverse peoples, territories, ecologies, etc., through wars of colonization, to secure territory and maintain the outflow of natural resources, human bodies, and ideas. And this was, fueling what Carl Polanyi called the satanic mill of the expanding self-regulating market. Now I'm going to shift to something that's called, like, new enclosures. And yeah, I like talking about the new enclosures because, capitalism isn't one static thing. Capitalism, there's many capitalisms. And capitalism changes and adapts over time pretty well, as we've seen. Sometimes not so well, as we're seeing now. So in the so this was about how many years apart? I don't know, about 20 years apart, there were two kind of special issues that came out called the New Enclosures. One came out in 1991, and it was I don't guess it was a special issue, but it was a collection of essays by the Midnight Notes Collective, which involved people like Silvia Federici, George Fenzis, Peter Linebaugh, and others. And then in either 2011, 2012, there was another special issue of the Journal of Peasant Studies called the New Enclosures, which was also very good, but coming from an agrarian political economy perspective. And if anyone's interested in the New Enclosures, I definitely recommend that you check out both of them. But yeah, in the past few decades, work on things like land grabbing, resource grabbing, green grabbing, these have all revitalized academic interest in enclosure. And what this kind of body of research has done, it really situated in agrarian political economy, political ecology, and also anthropology. What it's done is it showed how ostensibly old politics of resources involving primitive accumulation articulated in variegated ways since the 1970s with processes of neoliberalization. And this is where Hardin's tragedy of the commons really comes into play and enters the field of politics. And also since the late 2000s, especially with the new politics of intensifying, overlapping, and never-ending planetary crisis. Anybody remember around 2008, it was like the first big set of crisis narratives started coming out around food. It was like triple F, food, fuel, and finance, and everybody lost their houses because they got bad mortgages. Lots of things went pear-shaped in the 2000s, and it's relevant. But the work on the so-called new enclosures has been really important, to our theorization and understanding the spatialities and the temporalities and the coloniality and the violence of territorialization, the seizure of territories for either industrial developments, private property, biofuels, property of sorts, any number of things. It's offered a lens into accompanying political economic changes, forms of dispossession, and the sorts of institutional, political, and environmental changes that occur on the ground as, what's often described as the insecurity and unruliness, of the margins of the frontiers of the existing commons, are secured and transformed into property as capital, more conducive to value extraction. But the new enclosures involve more than land grabs for material resources to fuel industrial growth. It involves the sorts of north-south value chains that are fueling just energy transitions in Europe. Marx said that the expropriation of the mass of the people from the soil forms the basis of the capitalist mode of production. And yes, land is still a side of struggle, just as debt is a mechanism of dispossession, but never-ending institutional expansion and economic growth require that both external means of governance, like seen in the co-option of state power, and especially policing, as well as new inputs are continuously required. So this goes back to the myth of the self-totalizing and self-reproducing value system. It can't self-reproduce itself because it constantly needs more things to fuel more growth. If it was a static system, that might be different. But it probably wouldn't be. So when external inputs become themselves commodified or distorted production processes, capitalism has some existential crisis tendencies, and they become visible. So, and this was true from the very beginning. There's been the need to exploit non-marketized background conditions of life and nature. And this is, you know, this is related to, just going back to Polanyi, the notion of fictitious commodities that Polanyi developed. A lot of people think that, like, you know, like carbon offsets are fictitious commodities because they're fictional. They're not really real. They're intangible commodities. I mean, they are real, but they're certificates, right? You can't, like, yeah, go pick carbon off the tree. But yeah, oh yeah, fictitious commodities. Yeah, so fictitious commodities were like land, labor, and institutions, or money, depending on who you're talking to. And these are things that can never be fully commodified. Because these are what, you know, these background conditions in daily life are built on. So they can never be true commodities, because to truly commodify them and to build a market on them would, you know, just lead to everything collapsing. But yeah, the need to constantly find external inputs includes the need for manipulating external social values and structuring gender roles through social institutions like marriage and family, and doing so in ways that create continuously exploitable reservoirs of the means of social reproduction. The often underpaid or unpaid, highly racialized, highly gendered, of course, highly classed, you know, care work that involves human bodies, domestic laborers, and, you know, creates the workers, but also forms the basis of collective social power and the conditions for life that create and reproduce society as a whole, not just capitalism. But beyond this, extending processes of abstraction and market rationalization, commodification and financial logics, to plural forms of value that constitute the effective and embodied relationships between people, the technologies they use and develop, and more than human nature that sustain life and socio-ecological reproduction. So this process is at work in the reframing of nature as capitals, and biological life as intellectual property, in the financial and representational technologies that enable value to be extracted from crisis through various means, incentivize crisis as a growth opportunity, processes that flow through rural landscapes and urban neighborhoods via investor-driven renewal schemes and restoration regimes to arrive in new growth markets for non-conventional and intangible commodities like knowledge, cultural heritage, green assets, environmental offsets, and these are just to name a few. Cumulatively, the really expansive body of scholarship on the new enclosures drives home, really, I think, what we know intuitively, that dispossession isn't a one-off event located in the distant past at the dawn of capitalism, nor, as some Marxists might continue to claim, a dimension of agonistic politics setting the stage for the inevitable people's emancipation. It's a sediment of logic, and it's a regular return on pathways of control, value production, accumulation, and crisis that don't just feed on the gifts of nature, the free gifts of nature, nor the surplus value produced by formal labor markets, but on the very stuff of life. Thus, enclosure should be considered as an important and continuing process. It links people's experiences through time and space, shaping a field of everyday politics and struggle over meanings, world-making, and value that plays out across the spaces of what Max Haven, if you haven't read him, read him, he's great, calls the actuality of the commons. Not just what our movements and communities have built and claimed and named as commons, but those aspects of society and the earth that support our common existence, but which have been or are being or risk of being enclosed. So in this context, new relational notions of commons and commoning are figuring and like coming out of diverse people's struggles as a way to articulate anger, injustice, and politics. Not just a protest, but of like actually reclaiming space and agency to intervene against intersecting and intensifying forms of extraction, against policing, against ecocide. Practices of commenting are configuring new political spaces, configuring new networks, and new social ecologies. And they're working to address from below acute forms of damage that crises of globalization have brought on the institutional and natural orders, while imagining and cultivating social, technological, and ecological relationships that, that could be the basis of new orders and new natures. In commons, people are visioning and promoting more ecological relationships among society, technology, and the environment. And they're enacting futures in the present based on living, thinking, and acting in multi-species worlds. In the rural world, we see this, we see it in practice as commoning is mobilized to defend communities' claims to land, livelihood, cultural resources, against socially and ecologically destructive mining infrastructure projects. While in cities, commoning is being used to reclaim urban space for housing and social projects in the face of waves of gentrification that exclude and shut out working class people, the urban poor, and members of ethnic minority groups especially. Commoners are innovating in agroecology, forestry, permaculture, aiming to create and defend new production and distribution regimes that are based on the decommodification of food and based on firmly ecological values, while others are developing ways to foster biodiversity in cities and heal landscapes that are scarred by war. We see diversity and logic of contemporary commons in, for example, new and distinct organizational and democratic processes that are arising to varying degrees from commons-based practices in the context of, for example, municipalist movements in Europe and the United States, in the autonomous, participatory, and confederated democratic projects in Latin America and the Middle East, in ecological democracy in India. We see it in cooperative economies in Jackson, platform cooperatives, land and food sovereignty initiatives, these things that are growing around the world by many names. We also find, coming from these projects, new methods, technologies, and infrastructures, and new platforms for nurturing and expanding common practice and commons-based production systems. These are embodied in really exciting initiatives like community energy cooperatives, open seed sharing initiatives, digital platform cooperatives, peer production projects, open source software, copyleft, something really cool called BioLeft, and Creative Commons licensing schemes that are often lumped together under this category of the new commons, but are really, really diverse. But commons aren't new. There are always new things happening, being done in commons, but commons themselves aren't new. But I do think that we need new stories and new epistemic entry points for understanding the actuality of existing commons as part of a global but really variegated and rocky terrain of imagination, practice, knowledge production, and value struggle. And so if our starting point is a notion of the commons not as a thing, but as a plural and relational kind of framework for thinking about self-organized, situated processes as people, technology, and the environment are bound together through active social and political processes involving governance, social reproduction, etc., outside the direct control of state market actors and institutions, then I propose we can view these arrangements in three primary kind of ontological dimensions. There may be a fourth dimension, but maybe a fifth, but I've got three today. So the first of these is commons as relation, specifically as an ethical and value relation. So like resources don't exist prior to something being ascribed that status as a resource by people. I mean, resource is a social category. Commons can be seen from the standpoint of a resource or a constellation of resources, fine, but contrary to economistic, property-centered approaches, I think the material form that this takes is probably the least important aspect of them. Rather than constructing what Tanya Murray Lee calls something's resourceness de facto in terms of property, commoning creates what Massimo D'Angelis names commonwealth, which are the forms of value that embody the constituting, non-alienated, productive and reproductive relations, ethics, and labors that endow something, a place, a tool, a product, an idea, with value and status as an inherently social object. So second, commenting is a process. Specifically a process that's productive of these forms of value. Commenting describes active social and political processes related to governance, production, reproduction, and involving relations between people who come together and self-organize as a distinct self-represented community, including the sets of norms, practices, technologies, and ascribed values that are used to create, cultivate, or defend a resource or constellation of resources as defined in number 1, towards mutually agreed upon ends. And the third dimension of this is, of course, commenting a struggle, and specifically value struggle. This involves the internal negotiations, contestations, and conflicts within social processes of commenting, but more broadly, the tension between forms of commenting and enclosure that have been shaped by people's experiences and responses in the face of processes of colonization, gendered, racial, and class and caste-based exploitation, violence, and uneven development that has only intensified in recent decades, for many of these. In this framing, commons aren't a discourse of the West that emerged and then expanded beyond European borders. Rather, commons is just one word or one way to describe and make sense of a vital tension that emerges in different ways, in different places, and different times around the world. In this way, thinking about it, the notion of struggle connects all aspects of commenting. It connects commenting as practice, commenting as theory, and commenting as a methodology for doing, but also for understanding and making sense of crisis and ruptures in our lives and our places in deeply situated ways. This perspective, I propose, opens up not only analytic space for decoupling research on commons from Eurocentric narratives, economistic narratives, histories, and methodologies, but also opens a space for dismantling the false and largely academic disjuncture between research and doing, creating new stories and using them to plot pathways for enacting productive politics of possibilities based on collective striving. To paraphrase David Graeber, who really should be in rooms where we're talking about these things, unlike any other field of scholarship, anthropology can open windows on other possible forms of human social existence, showing that most of what we assume to be immutable has been, in other times and places, arranged quite differently, and therefore that human possibilities are in almost every way greater than we ordinarily imagine.